Hi, everyone. Welcome back. For our next discussion, I am delighted to be joined by Roland Fryer, a professor of economics at Harvard, the John A. Paulson Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and co-founder of Equal Opportunity Ventures. A recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship and the John Bates Clark Medal, he is widely recognized as one of the most accomplished, impactful, and innovative social scientists in the world. Roland's scholarship has greatly enriched our understanding of racial inequalities, and he's designed and implemented concrete policies that have significantly boosted educational achievement in some of the nation's poorest neighborhoods. Roland, in a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, you argued that we shouldn't abolish diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. We should focus them in a rigorous, thoughtful, serious way on developing talent. Can you talk to us about what diversity, equity, and inclusion means in practice and why we should save it from its excesses?
Wow, you came in a little hot there. But anyway, thank you for having me. And I'm one of those credentialed assholes Coleman was talking about. I feel sorry for you. You have to listen to me after Coleman. I was very impressed. In any event, DEI. I have to admit, I'm surprised at all the things that it means. When I think of DEI, I think of talent management. I think of the mathematical problem of selection, of optimizing, of trying to get the right people in the right slots to do the right things. An economist might say, getting to the talent frontier. That's how I think of DEI, and it's morphed into a lot more than that. It's morphed into identity statements and things like that, pledges of allegiance. And that part I think has to go away. That's silliness. I mean, Harvard and I had a scuffle a few years ago. If they really wanted to get rid of me, they should have told me to sign one of those statements. That would have been quick and clean. But what I really mean is, and I'm dead serious about this. One of the things that Coleman and I agree on, some stuff we disagree on, but one of the things we agree on is that this is a solvable problem. For example, I want to step back from. Let's first talk about DEI or as regards to college admissions. That's totally a solvable problem. We should collect a lot more data on the types of characteristics and traits that are predictive of performance in colleges. It's pretty simple. I am pretty sure, although no one told me, I benefited from DEI or affirmative action. I had pretty low SAT scores, not because I wasn't smart, but because I showed up there drunk from the night before. And I was only interested in getting past the NCAA threshold, which was 700, which is pretty easy to get past. And I got a low score on the SAT, but what it took to get that score, what I went through to get that score, was very different from the average American that had the same score. And so the amount of latent talent underneath my score was different. And that's the type of exercise that I want colleges to go through, to take into account in a rigorous way, not a let me think about it way, a way to use test scores, of course, because they're predictive. But what we're really trying to understand is what is the latent ability of this 17-year-old who's applying? And then I want them to admit those with the highest latent ability, independent of race. Now, race will come into that because of how it's correlated with class and neighborhood and all sorts of other things, but it won't come in directly, or it may not come in directly. And so what I'm saying is, I would imagine an admissions policy might say a 1,200 from an independent private school is less, maybe, we'd have to actually let the data talk, maybe less impressive than a 1,200 from an inner city resident who doesn't know their parents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to find a mathematical way to make those adjustments in the right way. That is talent optimization. Giving my daughters preferential treatment, you should never do. Because if my daughters can't make it past any threshold when they are 17, it's not because there's systemic racism, it's because they suck. And that's okay. I've told my youngest, you're probably not going to be employable, but daddy's got you.
That's the American dream, Roland.
100%. People ask me, why do you still work so hard? I was like, because I got 3 or 4 generations to fund. These kids are not going to get it done. And so that's what I mean there. And it's a similar type of problem when it comes to large enterprises and things like that. And I've worked with, over the past couple years, I've worked with a lot of large enterprises. It is about talent optimization. And what I want people to do is to collect the data in order to do that. Now, in the Washington, it was in the New York Times when the Supreme Court decision was made. I had a piece, and some people thought it was satire. It was not satire. I was dead serious. If Harvard cares so much about inner city kids, if they care as much as I do, then let's work together and let's put academies across the country. You can start them in 9th grade, start them in 6th if you want, start them anytime you want. And I think Harvard should run them. And what we're going to do is we can have whatever threshold they want to get in those academies, but we are going to make them such that when the kids graduate, they are ready in a meritocratic way to compete. And anything else is insulting.
Roland, did then Harvard President Claudine Gay reach out to you to say, let's get these started,
Yeah.
let's get this off the ground?
Yeah. Oh, CG? Yeah. I probably shouldn't say that. No, she did not reach out. No one reached out.
So, Roland, in a as yet unpublished memoir, you have this incredible passage where you're describing the dilemma you faced when you were researching the sources of racial wage gaps. There was a hypothesis that you wanted to test and that you were frankly pretty convinced of from the get-go, that these disparities were driven by racism. And you talk a bit about what you ultimately found was largely behind those disparities. Can you talk to us a little bit about that experience and how that shaped your thinking?
Sure. Let me take one step back. I was raised mostly by my grandmother. Actually, it's an amazing day because today, 10 years ago, she passed away. And my grandmother and I, she was a real hero to me. And we talked every day. And even the last month or so of her life, I sat next to her. And it got to a point where she couldn't speak. And so that's when I decided to tell her and confess all the things I did as a kid. I'm not joking. That's how my brain works. I'm a consummate economist. When the cost was low, it was time to go. I had the great fortune, we did not grow up with a lot of money, but I had the great fortune of listening to her and her friends talk about race in America. I disagreed with them vehemently, but she's a Southern grandmother, so it's vehemently but quietly. And I remember one instance, we went to McDonald's. It was two for two Big Macs for $2. And we went in and I don't know, let's call it $9.50. My grandmother gives $10 and the woman puts the change on the counter. And we walk out in the parking lot and my grandmother's incensed. And I said, what's wrong? And she said, did you see that? Did you see that? That white woman didn't want to touch me. And I said, Grandma, I don't know. I think she just didn't want to pass germs or something. And we got into a long debate, and we debated back and forth all the time. But when I grew up, I'm not as elegant as to call something the Oppression Olympics. That's pretty good. I'm going to steal that one. But it definitely was, an art form, a game, where we would talk about how much discrimination there was in the world. So I grew up like that. I went to graduate school like that. And never did the economics and how I was raised ever collide until one night studying with Brian McCannon. Brian's a great, great guy. We were the only two Americans in my PhD program. And so I like to study with Brian, except for the fact that Brian made awful, awful coffee. Brian was from the cornfields of Illinois. He and I couldn't have grown up any more different. But who cared? Here we were with dynamic programming, and it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and we had a chalkboard. And Brian would brew coffee, and he was cheap because he was from them damn cornfields. And so he would brew the coffee, and instead of putting more, like changing the coffee filter, he'd just sprinkle some grinds on top and rebrew it, and it was disgusting, but I didn't have any money, so I drank it. And one night we got to talking, during the time where you could have conversations on college campuses. And I said, man, I confessed to him that I could, something that frankly black people in the South would do with one another, it was okay. I said to him, Brian, man, I can tell a racist on sight. He said, you what? I said, yeah, of course. I can tell who's racist. Like that professor over there, racist. That one, not so much. And this would pass in my neighborhood. People are like, yeah, I can see that. Yeah. And I'm not discouraging where I came from. Understand, it's just the way we did it. And Brian busted out laughing in my face. And I said, what's funny? He says, dude, we're talking about n-dimensional vectors on the chalkboard. And what does compactness mean? And what does upper hemicontinuous in some functional space look like? Yet you can tell a racist on sight? And I'd never really, and so I obviously went back to my grandmother for comfort. And I said, I was talking to this white dude from Illinois. And I told him what we do, and he said I was crazy. And she says, he's from cornfields? I said, yeah, well, that explains it, baby. She fully comforted me. In any event, so I got to thinking whether or not this was actually true. And about that time, Derek Neal and William Johnson had put out a paper. And the paper was about trying to understand how much of racial differences, this is a really key point. We should do this in every regard, but in this case it was with respect to wages. If you see a disparity, the question is how much of that disparity, like in labor market wages, is coming because people are coming to the labor force with different skills, and those skills are being priced accordingly. Okay? That's called a labor market. Versus, are people coming with the same skills, and those skills are actually getting different prices? That's discrimination. I never really thought about it that way. Neal and Johnson wrote this paper in 1996. I read it in graduate school in 2000 or so. And it basically said, look, there is 25% difference between blacks and whites in terms of wages. And once you account for one thing, the skills that they have when they're between 14 and 17 years old, that 25% goes down to 7% for men, and it's actually positive 3% for women. I thought, there's no way this is true. Just no way. And I beat that paper up as much as you could possibly do as a graduate student. I mean, I beat it to death. And that was the first time I was faced with this fact that this difference inside of me, to be very honest about it, really came to a head. And luckily, the economist in me, I believe, or hope, always wins out. But I really went after that paper, and it turns out it's right, that the majority of labor market disparities are due to people coming to the market with different skills, not the same skill bundle being priced differently. But for me, I always hold these two things inside of me, which is I constantly hear my grandmother in my head, but the reason that I went into economics and got all those credentials was so that I could ignore it more, so that I would have the confidence and the skills to be able to put those theories to the test.
So when you think about an approach to DEI that would work, am I understanding correctly that it's an approach that's all about developing, optimizing, maximizing that talent in that crucial window? So when you're looking at the 14 to 17-year-olds, when you're looking at those kind of basic skills, how do you ensure that people are in a position to be competitively qualified? Or is there something even beyond that, kind of in the next 10, 15, 20 years, that can be cultivated?
Technically, it's going to be both, because remember, I said even after you do this, 7% is left. You ignored that part. So the 7% is left, so there needs to be something that addresses the 7%.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of it's pre-market, right? And so...
and the results at 14 to 17, that could have its origins long before.
100%, right? And so that's K through 12, whatever it is, we can go there. Let's take the NFL. I looked into this whole black coaches thing, and turns out there is 640. I'm a nerd. I apologize. I can't hide it. I'm not trying to be like Coleman, but it's not working. Coleman's a nerd too, but he just plays more smooth than I do. There's 643 coaches that have ever coached in the NFL, and we all have been witness to whether or not the black coaches and stuff like that. Okay, got it. I was really interested in this, worked with the NFL to do it. 643 black coaches. So what we did was we mapped out every path that has ever gotten to be a black coach, right? Okay, so then the question becomes, let me translate the question I did before about prices versus skills. In this context, it's, are they on the same path where most people get to be head coaches in the NFL and are being passed over, or are they different paths? And the answer for the NFL, they didn't like it very much, is that they're on different paths, right? So the way to become an NFL head coach is that you become, Nick Saban, and you're a Power 5 coach, and you win, and then you go and you're a defensive coordinator for the Cowboys, and then you win, and then you become a head coach. Anyone of any race who does that has a similar probability of becoming a head coach. But that's the same type of thing that happens in corporations all the time, right? You look across and you say, I don't have enough of group A amongst my managers. Okay, take out head coach and replace with manager. And then you have two options. You can actually get the data and do it the right way and say, what are the paths to become managers? And what does the funnel look like across those things? And are there any biases there that I actually need to take care of? That's 7%. Or you can do it the lazy way, like we do admissions and a lot of these problems, and say, I'll just take that one from over there and put him there, and then I can check this box and move on. And that's when the problem occurs. See, when I think about DEI, I'm thinking about and, not or. And what I mean by that is I'm thinking about talent, I'm thinking about more productivity and diversity. But when most people think about DEI, they think about or, productivity or diversity. I am not for productivity or diversity. I'm not for a trade-off. Here's a simple theorem. If any company or university is at their talent frontier, there's no bias in that system. If there's no bias in that system, then you have the and.
Roland, part of what I'm hearing from you is about reconciling patience and urgency. So on the one hand, if you're an institution, let's say you're an institution like an elite university or an elite corporation that has a lot of visibility, a lot of influence, and there's a political dimension to what you do. Maybe you're in the C-suite and you care about your legitimacy. You care about wanting to be seen as broadly representative, and you feel like if you don't get that right, there's going to be hell to pay, right? So you have a sense of urgency around it. You need to get to the right place fast. On the other hand, what you're talking about is if you're going to put people on the path to being competitively qualified, you need to start way, way before you're 18 or way, way before you're 28 and you're going to be hired or not hired as a machine learning specialist at Alphabet or NVIDIA or whatever. So I'm curious, how do you think about that patience versus urgency? Because I'm sure you have some sympathy for that person at elite university X who's saying, look, I get it. A lot of these things are starting way, way before in pre-K, but I have this problem of not wanting to be embarrassed by the fact that my institution is not representative. So I wonder how you think about that. How do you talk to people about that when they're coming to you for your guidance and a kind of research-oriented, evidence-oriented perspective?
I had that kind of patience 21 years ago when I started this, but they didn't do anything then either. I had that kind of patience 18 years ago. They didn't do it then either. So no, I don't have any patience now. My view now is do it the right way, right? Like, and I think all of this becomes an excuse for inaction. And if we really wanted to solve this problem, right? Like yesterday, I was in New York at a conference with a lot of corporate CEOs, and I was trying to get them to do the data-driven approach to talent optimization / DEI. And someone said, well, I mean, I guess we could do this data approach, but it would be 5 or 10 years. And I said to him, if I told you your product line, I could increase productivity by 20 to 25% if I collected this right data, it would be a 5 or 10 minute problem, not a 5 or 10 year problem. And so I just don't buy it. If university administrators, I think people would have a lot of patience. In fact, not just patience, they would be gratified and they would be happy to hear real leadership coming from a university saying, here, we've tried these Band-Aid approaches before. We're done with checkbox activities.
So we're done with just admitting the student who went to Exeter who is not necessarily high. We actually want to develop that talent.
Yes, we are done admitting kids who have low mean and low variance. I'm fine with low mean if you got high variance. I'm not fine with low mean if you have low variance. And so we're done with that. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually solve this problem in the way that we all know. And this is symptomatic of something that really drives me nuts. We have all these brilliant people in my department and departments around the university. It's not like we don't know how to solve this problem. Nothing I've told you is all that interesting. Right? It is a relationship between a set of X's and an outcome. And then you predict from that. Duh. Right? Like it's really that simple. And so the reason that we're not doing it is not because we can't put a person on the moon. It's because we don't care that much. And the sooner I'm annoyed. I don't mean to be, I'm sorry. I'm at that now age where I just want people to get off my porch. But I've been doing this for so long. I just want to solve the problem. And you know how frustrating it is when there's literally mathematical theorems about how to do this and we won't do it.
You're unusual in that over the course of your career, you have actually solved problems. You've actually solved some big problems, at least in an experimental setting. In one instance, you worked with a series of underperforming public schools in Houston, and you said, hey, look, let's adopt a battery of different strategies to change the way instruction happens in these schools. And as I recall, it actually had a pretty significant impact. Can you talk to us a bit about that experience and what you took away from it?
Sure. And I've also had experiments that don't work at all, to be clear. And
that's the way it should be.
When I was in the Bloomberg administration, my title was the Chief Equality Officer. And after my first few experiments, my wife said they should change it to the Chief Inequality Officer because you keep screwing up everything. Yeah, so we went to Houston. I didn't mean to, but the superintendent, they had a dinner at Harvard, and the superintendent came, and it was at the president's house, and somehow I got invited. I normally don't get invited to those kind of dinners. And so I went, and it was a bunch of people from the ed school, and the ed school was giving the superintendent a lot of advice. Here's what you should do, and here's what you should do, and here's what you do. And the superintendent, to his credit, sat there and took it. And as they were serving dessert, the superintendent says, these sound like some great ideas. Who at the table's ready to roll their sleeves up, come to Houston and help me change it? And he said, I'll never forget this, he said, the racial achievement gap is a cancer, and I'm ready to cure cancer. Who's with me? As you might expect from meeting me for like 20 minutes now, the only fool at the table, I was like, me, right? And I remember the president at the time was like, please put your hand down. So here's what we did. I was really interested in, and so the average, some of my research showed that the average charter school is no better than the average public school, but there's a lot of variance. And so there are charter schools on the right-hand part of that distribution. They're amazing. Success Academy, amazing. Harlem Children's Zone, you've heard them all. There's after-school specials about them. But if the average is 0, that means there's some on the left-hand side of that distribution that are awful. I actually personally think it'd be funny to see those after-school specials. And what we did was we went and took really a bioinformatics. My wife is in computational biology, and so over dinner I get to learn about that stuff. And so I took a bioinformatics approach. So we essentially collected on 100 charter schools in New York City, thousands and thousands and thousands of variables, more than you could ever imagine. And on everything, we videotaped the kids and how they transitioned hallways. I won't bore you with the details. It was a lot of variables. And then what was nice about doing this in charter schools was that we could calculate the actual causal effect of going to those schools through lottery-based analysis. And so on the left-hand side, we had value add of going, and on the right-hand side, we had lots and lots of variables, right? This is what they do in bioinformatics when they sequence the genome and they want to try to understand what SNPs of the genome are predictive of a particular thing like diabetes, okay? Lots of right-hand side variables, a few left-hand side variables. We did that. We found 5 variables that explained 50% of the variance in what made some charter schools great and other charter schools not so great. Those 5 things were more time in school. So I call it the basic physics of education. If someone's ahead of you, you either have to work harder to catch up or tell them, could you please take Friday off? But you need to change the differential on time. And then it was human capital. The teachers were really important. Third was they call it small learning communities. I think of it as tutoring, high dosage tutoring, tutoring kids in small groups for a lot of hours. And then there was how you use data to drive instruction, really important. When I got started, a gazillion years ago now, data was an asset in schools. Now I think oftentimes it's a liability, right? Everyone's got a bunch of data, they have no idea what to do with it. It's like HR departments, they're also swimming in data and don't know what to do with it. And so, but what we found was that schools that had real action plans, so I test kids, they don't pass, I can reroute them through our system in this way, had better results. The final one was culture and expectations. And that was one of the bigger coefficients. Everyone understood that you were dealing with 88% oftentimes female-headed households. I mean, Ian Rowe is here, he's the king of this, so I feel silly telling you this. But culture and expectations was really, really important. And so we took those 5 things and we wanted to implement them in a randomized controlled trial. I really am a nerd. I don't tie my shoes without treatment a control group. I'm just really into it. My grandmother was an educator, by the way. She was a 6th grade teacher. And I remember, every now and then she would ask me what I do at work. Most of the time she would call and we would gossip about people in the neighborhood. But I was her gossip partner, and so that was fine. And but I remember one day she called me. She says, "What is it?" And I told her about these 5 things. And my grandmother said to me, "Baby, they pay you for that shit." And I said, "Not as much as Coleman Hughes, Grandma." And so we wanted to take those 5 things and put them in regular old public schools. And so we searched literally, I won't bore you with the details, we searched around the world for this. We went to India and they were like, no. Seriously, we went to rural India and they're like, we can do 3 of them, but we're not doing all 5. We went to Haiti after the earthquake and they said, we'd rather not have schools than to have you here. It was really awful. My self-esteem was terrible. And so this Houston dinner, turns out we did it in Houston. And we implemented these 5 things with fidelity in 20 schools in Houston. Why 20? Because I needed enough sample. And we lengthened the amount of school time they spent in school by 20%. We had them come back earlier. We had them stay longer. We hired 500 tutors for these 20 schools. It cost about millions of dollars to do this experiment, but we could only afford to do it in 4th, 6th, and 9th grades. We brought data systems in and figured out real action plans for the teachers. We also removed half the teachers in the schools and all of the principals, actually 19 out of 20 principals. And we interviewed every single teacher in the school and figured it out. And what happened over the 3 years of the experiment was that in 3 years, we closed the racial achievement gap in the elementary schools. In the middle and high schools, it was closed in 4 years in math and cut in about a third to a half in reading. Doing my best Ian Rowe impersonation, all 4 of our high schools, every single kid was admitted to a 2 or 4 year school. Now, I didn't know how easy it was because Ian doesn't tell you the secrets, but it turns out if you lock them in the gym and don't let them out until they apply to school, it works. So this was really important to me because what it meant was, in all seriousness, people view Eva Moskowitz and Jeff Canada as these heroes that can't be replicated. And when I first met them, my basic view was, let's figure out how we can boil you down to pill form and distribute you. That's most important to me. And I thought, if I could get a third of the effect of Success Academy everywhere, that was a huge bonus.
Was the issue about scaling these approaches the cost? Was it the lack of willingness to make the really aggressive staffing changes that you need to make? Was it the fact that you can't scale those staffing changes because you only have so many people who graduate from college every year willing to teach to really remake the teaching profession? What do you see as the barrier to scaling these tactics that you adopted in Houston?
I think, I'm an economist, so I think the barrier to scaling was not understanding the minimum dosage needed. And that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to get at, like, what Ian does in a school is pure art. It's like, you know, you go to a fantastic chef and they make this amazing meal and you go at home and try it and it doesn't really work out.
So what's the fast food version of this? What's the accessible?
I wouldn't go fast food, I'd say fast casual. Right. But you know, like, what's the be good version, right? Like something better than, you know, McDonald's. But yes, that's exactly it. How can we distribute this widely? And what we found was that in our experiment, we got exactly the same results as the Harlem Children's Zone and the Success Academies, right? And so we were very, very proud of that because we got it at scale. We not only did it in Houston, we did it in Denver, we did it in Massachusetts. I mean, you could actually replicate this, but it took political will. There were plenty of places who said, hey, Roland, you didn't tell me people were gonna hate me when I did this. And I said, I tell them, you know, you can't save the black kids and win the popularity contest in the same year. It's usually staggered. You help them, then win, right? And so I think it's combinations of all of them, but I really want to double down on this will question. If a nerd who grew up 30 minutes from here can do it, right? No one was saying Roland's great, and if he can do a school like that's, you know, that doesn't mean that anyone can do it. People were saying if that bozo can do schools, then anyone can do schools, and that's what I wanted to show. That if we're really serious about this, we treat these problems like simple engineering problems. What works? Boil it down using data, and then go test it. Go into the market and actually test it. In this case, I think I'm very proud of the work that the folks did who worked on this, and I think it worked.
You are someone who really focuses on being really rigorous, making sure the evidence base is there before you, pursue an intervention. You are also, however, someone who is really a pretty radical proponent of school choice. And by school choice, I don't mean call it the Bloomberg era approach of we are going to go with high-performing, proven charter networks in a highly regulated environment. You've been saying, let's give cash. Let's give cash to families to use for some educational purpose or another. Let's have as few restrictions and regulations as we can get away with. And let's embrace that really aggressively, call it free market brand of school choice.
Yes.
Why is that? Because again, there are a lot of people that you worked with in the Bloomberg administration. There are a lot of other smart, serious, thoughtful people who want to get it right, who are saying, Roland, it's incredibly dangerous. You're going to have fly-by-night operations that are not going to be rigorous, that are not going to be evidence-based, that are not going to have the same standards. So why are you so laissez-faire about it?
Because I understand how markets work, because I understand the rule of the second best. So the rule of the second best is, if you don't have a true market, then making something more like a market is not a real thing. you can't really predict that it's going to be better if you make it more like a market and you don't have it. And when you sit back and think about what we're talking about now in terms of school choice, and you think about how we typically think about markets, I think it'll make you kind of chuckle to yourself, right? It's so ludicrous, in my opinion. Right? The way real markets work is if you have a pizza spot and I have a pizza spot, and my pizza's just demonstrably better, then people come to mine and they're willing to wait in line, and if the line gets too long, I get 2 and I get 3 pizza spots, and you sit over there and no one comes to your pizza, and it's actually then becomes a signaling value to the market. They go, I don't want pizza that nobody else wants, and they stand in my line, and you go out of business. If that's school choice the way we practice it now, there's a long line out of mine, and when the line gets too long, some government official comes into half the line and puts a little breaker and says, you go to that bad pizza spot. We love choice here. That's not real choice. And so, and making that slightly more like a market by putting another bad pizza spot there that's not how markets work. That's not capitalism. And it wasn't Milton Friedman's real vision. And I think we made a lot of maybe prudent compromises along the way. But what I'm really excited about is the advent of ESAs. And when I was doing, little known fact, when I was doing education policy for JEB, I've got a great history. Everyone I work for in terms of politics really gets out of the race pretty quickly. That was our vision, was to, if a student gets $20,000 for their per pupil expenditure, to make that transportable. Let them take it anywhere they want. And then we wouldn't have to worry about busing, because people would look at inner cities like Oak Cliff, close to here, and they would say, there's a lot of $20,000 checks out there. Maybe I should build a branch campus of my independent school close to them. And there'd be other entrepreneurs that would prop up. And so if you look at what's happening now in the education space with micro schools and online schools and private schools, all fueled by what's going on with ESAs, it's quite exciting. And so that is the type of school choice I want.
Roland, I'm going to open it up for questions to the group, but just one last question for me before we do that. This is more of a philosophical question, coming back to the question of DEI. You have focused a lot of energy and effort on the racial achievement gap. There is a line of argument, however, which is that we shouldn't really concern ourselves with gaps. We should be focusing on absolute gains across the population. That said, we also live in a world of scarce resources. So I just want to ask you how you think about this. If you were thinking about taking a kitty of money, like the kitty of money that you had, but say on a much, much bigger scale to help improve those schools in Houston, would you say, let's go for the low-hanging fruit. Let's find the most gifted students as evidenced by, let's say, a universal screening, something like that, and pour more resources at them to see if we can just kind of generate more inventions, more entrepreneurship out of that group? Or would you say, let's look at the kind of bottom fifth of the distribution and let's see what we can do there?
It's a good question. I was worried it was going to be a philosophical question. That's an economic question, because I'm terrible at philosophy. That's really a question about, you're asking me whether or not there's diminishing marginal returns. And I think there is, right? So if you come to my kids and you say, okay, I'm going to give you $10 more in your school, or $20 more, or $100, or $1,000 more, right? Do you know I pay $60,000 for fifth grade, homie? I mean, it's just so crazy. It's not going to have any effect, because there's so many resources already being pumped into those schools. Versus and so a marginally better teacher in that school is going to have less of an effect than a better teacher in an inner city school. And so if you want to increase total production, that's why I focus on gaps a lot. But it's a good question. But it's not empirically, I don't think it's that relevant right now, because if you look at achievement in America generally, it's been relatively flat over the last 30 years. Any ticks up have been the kind of optimism that Coleman talked about. The black test scores have gone up since 2001, since No Child Left Behind. And that really, I think, explains a lot of the marginal increases in NAEP. So if we've been flat and there's still gaps, my sense is that we should focus on those. And I don't think there's an issue focusing on those. I don't think it's detrimental to the identity of the students in these schools or general politics. I really believe we have a human capital production problem in America. And I believe that many of the social ills that we see would be dramatically reduced if we solved that problem.
To put a fine point on it, though, in your vision of DEI, you're not saying if there are disparities in the test is racist. You're saying that if there are disparities, we need to see if there's talent to be optimized. How do we apply that? How do we deploy those resources?
100%. If the thermometer tells you you're cold, the first thing you do is not throw out the thermometer. That's silly. Nothing I've ever said would even lead anyone to believe that. I know you don't believe it, but no, of course not. But I do believe...
It is a rather popular view these days in some circles.
Well, you're in the wrong circles, bro. I think that, I do believe that talent, it may sound silly, and I know people have talked about this before, but I do believe talent is distributed uniformly in opportunity.
Racist thermometers would be good op-ed for the moment, by the way. I think that's
by Rayhan. I think that, no, but I do believe talent is distributed uniformly, and opportunity is not. And I've had a front row seat to that in my life, right? I have seen gallons of talent wasted in the neighborhoods I grew up in. And I've seen ounces of talent nurtured around my daughters, okay? And I'm not begrudging people who are nurturing those ounces of talent. I do it myself. I went to a recital with my daughters. It was terrible. I'm in the front row. This is fantastic. Right? And I'm saying, dear Lord, don't strike me down. This is a real life. This is good. And I'm okay with that. But I want to put that, I think if we put that same type of attention in every neighborhood through very good schools and very good public policies, that kids can flourish. And then all these things that we talked about having different, it all goes away if we actually go and fix that problem. Not everything in corporate America will go away, but the problem will become a lot smaller, and we can narrowly tailor things there that might be helpful. That's my vision of DEI.
Thank you, Roland. Any questions from the group? Oh, there's no.
We haven't talked about, as we talk about education, about vocational schools. How do you see? Have you done any work studying? And I guess I should ask the question: are there any vocational schools at the high school level anymore? Anyway,
there are, and I think that there's a renewed focus on it because there's such a gap in the skilled trades. And I see a lot of companies being started trying to figure out how to close the gap in the skilled trades. Wind turbine tech, one of the things where supply and demand just don't meet. I could go on and on. I think that, in fact, I know that there are a lot of very interesting entrepreneurs trying to crack this space that used to be occupied almost exclusively by community colleges, HVAC techs. HVAC, what a great job, right? I was talking to a gentleman yesterday who employs 10,000 new people on shipyards every year. And I asked him, what's the rate limiting step of getting people to these shipyards? And he says, damn HVACs, right? It's such a better job. And so there's a big gap in terms of supply and demand on these skilled trades. And I know that entrepreneurs are trying to solve this problem, and there's going to be a lot of competitive pressure put on high schools and community colleges because people are starting to say, 2-year program, I can get you through this in 6 weeks with technology. And so I think stay tuned. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in that space.
So you talked about the 5 factors that you see, within the schools that sort of predicted success. Have you ever either done studies or familiar with studies that look at the factors within the home that predict success, right? Like how often parents read to the children and at what age they start reading. Because from what I see in terms of education research, there's a lot on disparity. There are a lot of interventions on sort of the equity and anti-racism front. I almost never, aside from the Coleman report, which was in 1964, 66, I don't think I've heard of another study that looked at parental factors in education. And I wonder if you could speak to that at all.
It's a great question. They're there, it's just hidden because people don't highlight it anymore. But for example, we tested, I was really interested in how early the gap starts. So we tested 10,868 8-month-olds. And I won't bore you, but the results are, in the raw data, there's no difference between black 8-month-olds and white 8-month-olds or Hispanic 8-month-olds or anybody 8-month-olds, except little baby girls are smarter than little baby boys. Shocking. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know, sound like my grandmother. They pay you for that shit. It's like, really? You But by age 2, the distributions start to pull apart. Age 4, they start to pull apart. Now, what do? If you just control for the situation at home, education of the parents, the age that the mother was at the time of the first birth, income, occupation, one of my favorite, the number of books in the home. All those gaps go away. So all the gaps pre-going to school can be explained by parental factors. People don't highlight that, but that's true. What's interesting is once they enter school, schools are the problem, right? So Horace Mann was exactly wrong. And so I think that there's a lot of research that show, and what you see over time, last thing, and I'll shut up, is if you look at the coefficients on the parental factors over time, as kids get into school, the magnitude of those coefficients go down as kids age. So the parental factors become less important. I know Ian's going to beat me up for that afterwards. We'll talk about it. Parental factors become less important, and it is just true. And the school you're going to becomes really, really important. So that's my recollection of where the literature is.
I'm afraid we're at the end of our time, but I'm going to just ask for your patience so we can take 2 more questions. There's a gentleman here, and there's another person at the table in the back. So brief questions, please. Thank you.
Yep. I was a turnaround principal from my last year in K-12 was 2014. I used a lot of your research, particularly on the issue of time. 95% of my students were low socioeconomic, and we earned the state award. My question is, in 2014, I left K-12 to go higher ed. And as a turnaround principal, I always wanted to choose my person following me to make sure that things continued. I didn't get to do that in 2014 because a new board came in that was very much DEI, woke focus. School went straight down. In 3 months, it went down the tubes. This session is about DEI. I see DEI in 2 components. One, higher ed being more as a lens, but I also see it being an agenda in K-12 that I think is very damaging to the kids that I think DEI folks are saying they should have. Look at Florida. Low socioeconomic students, students with learning disabilities, Hispanic students do better on the NAEP in that state than in any other state in the nation. DEI folks hate Florida. Wisconsin, I did my doctorate at the University of Wisconsin, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who I love, but is pushing the DEI agenda. African Americans perform last on the NAEP assessment in Wisconsin. Could you speak to the difference, and what do you think about that reality?
I have not done any, what you said is striking, and I have not done any research on this whatsoever. As a human being, my daughters are exposed to this, and as you might imagine, I care a lot. And I feel sorry for my daughter's school because they have me on the other side. And, you know, they'll read a book about, I don't know, let's call it Rosa Parks. I wish they were that creative. It's not Rosa Parks, but let's imagine it is. And they send a note home and say, we covered Rosa Parks today, and here were the major themes. And as soon as I get that email, I write right back, and I say, could you give me the section of the curriculum where you can show me the strategies you use to ensure that my daughter comes out of that discussion with more agency, not less? And they're like, Actually, what they said was, you should be on our DEI committee. I said, you don't want that? I don't want that. So I don't know generally, but I'm very sensitive to that. And I think that there's going to be, some of the younger scholars, the braver ones, will look into that and see. It's got to have some real effects. But in my own household, my daughters know that their ideas are their only constraints.
Roland, quick question. I'm interested to know, to what degree and why are you committed to DEI as a term? I know you talk about optimization, but you continue to use the term, and there's so much connotation and baggage and politicization. It seems like you're wed to it for a reason, or you feel like it's worthy of being salvaged. And I'm just curious to know, because you could easily reframe it, use different language, but you're walking into the fire for some reason. I want to know why.
Probably because I'm always so hot I don't notice. No, it's not for any reason. It's really no reason. I'm not hanging on to it for any reason. I don't pay attention to language in the ways I should, honestly. I pay attention to the substance. I redefined DEI up here and told you what I meant, right? So I pay attention to that. But, guys like you and I have lived through all the name changes, right? I was black, African American. I've been a lot. I've heard it called the racial achievement gap, or the opportunity gap. All the damn names changed, but none of the substance does, and the problems still hang around. And so that's so super. I don't mean to offend any. Well, I don't care, but it's just so superficial, right? And my whole point is that we've got to get beneath all of this and really solve the problems. And so I make everyone this deal. If we can solve the problems together, you can call it whatever you want after we're done.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Roland Fryer.